Awesome. Thank you so much for everyone who's joining me this late afternoon, evening, mid-afternoon, I guess, wherever you are. This subject, but Nick Cave in general as primary focus for a lot of my research is such a passion, we might say obsession of mine, and having other people interested in exploring and going on this journey means so much. Uh, it is worth noting, right, that this is going to be just a small slice of the Nick Cave pie as far as art goes. He has been making music for over 50 years at this point. And we would absolutely not be able to capture more than a tiny little slice of the pie in a period of time that we have today. I'm grateful for that time. And so I've chosen to essentially stick to the first 5 years of his career. One, because I think you see a lot of really interesting stuff happening in that first 5 years as far as the Gothic woman, mostly because of the introduction of Anita Lane into his life. But I had a wonderful question from someone in the last session who was like, okay, but is this a through line throughout all of his career? And if you were to seek it out in his later albums, could you find the footprint there? And I just want to say totally, and I encourage you to look at all of his work. Who is Nick Cave? Great question. So glad you asked. We're going to talk about some of the historical kind of details that made him who he was in a moment. But I wanted to start off with a visual cue. Just as a heads up, we are doing again early career Nick Cave. He has made a reputation for himself in more recent years of kind of choral, loungy, choiry, almost kind of music. The earlier phases of his career much more dissonant. This is the post-punk noise rock era. There is screaming, so if you want to turn down your volume, etc., you're welcome to do that for some of these. We're going to start off with our kind of inception point, the genealogical beginning of Cave's career, which is The Boys Next Door. And I just want to show you also where we end up by the time we're kind of talking about the later songs in this exploration. So that means we are going to start off with Shivers. A few, I'll remember, Sam. A few short years, we end up with this fella. This is a junkyard performance with The Birthday Party, which is the band's name after they move from Melbourne, Australia to London and then Berlin. I include when I can video because I think it's really, really important to understanding the Gothic image. Nick Cave famously is the first to say that he is not a goth. He doesn't want to be called a goth, et cetera, as far as the musical genre goes. But I think for those of us familiar with the literary and filmic and artistic genre of the Gothic, it's really hard to dispute. There's a lot of corollary there, right? So, born September 22nd, 1957, in Warracknabeal, Australia, Nick Cave was born into this rural landscape, the kind of landscape that comes up actually a lot in, for instance, Picnic at Hanging Rock, right? Um, when he was young-ish, a child, but an older child, his family moved to Wangaratta, which is a slightly more developed town, but still very rural compared to at the time, and this would be around the mid 60s, Melbourne, which is a really rich city, bustling from money that's related to the gold rush that had just blown up the arts, the culture of the city, and made it really cosmopolitan. Nick got into a lot of trouble in high school, so it would surprise no one. He was a little too smart for the environment he was in. He got bored very easily. And so he was sent to a kind of boys' finishing school in Melbourne, very strict in their policy, try and make the boys prepared to be men, so to speak. And that's where he met Tracy Pugh, Phil Calvert, and Mick Harvey. Mick Harvey, who would go on in particular to make music with Nick well into the Bad Seeds careers, right? Nick's father was an English teacher. This is really important, actually, I think, to the origin story of Nick's influences. And he actually made Nick read the kind of opening pages of Lolita when he was a young boy. There's a lot of feelings we all can obviously have about this, and I think none of them have to do with pretending that Nabokov isn't a beautiful writer. But I think it is really important also for understanding the Gothic motifs within Nick's writing because we have this aggrandizement in many ways of the antagonist as a protagonist, right? You have a villainous, desirous, lecherous, whatever person that is essentially the hero of a story. And that is an interesting perspective to take both in literature and in music. And it's also really reflective. And I think Nick's love of vocabulary. He was famous for carrying around a little journal that he would write new words he discovered in, so that he could do what he would later call annihilation of language when writing his novel On the Assault of the Angel. Literature is important and defining for his relationship with his father and the way that Nick perceives the world. And later in high school, he becomes really interested in both the Romantics and Dostoevsky as well. But by the time Cave was playing music with his first band, mostly comprised of his schoolmates, the boys next door, he experienced the first tragic death. His father, Colin Cave, in a car accident. He was about, I think it was 18, 19 at the time. And over his life, this would be followed by the tragic deaths of two sons, Jethro, who he had with model Beau Lazenby, and who was his oldest son, and Arthur, who he has with Susie Bick, and was twin brothers to Earl, who survives. The themes of death are probably the most prevailing in his entire 50 years of art making. While the early work of the boys next door did not rely on the motif of the Gothic woman as much as like satire and melodrama and again self-aggrandizement, we begin to see the Gothic woman appear in the song Dive Position, which we'll explore later on the record Door Door. And for me personally, it's of no coincidence that the appearance of the strange, enchanting, and spectral figure of the Gothic woman appears concurrently with the introduction of Anita Lane into his life. Cave's first major romantic relationship, which would last until like the mid 80s, but go on into the 90s as well, on and off, and shape his sound, aesthetics, taste, and varieties, even up into his current work with his most recent album, Wild God, featuring a song dedicated to Anita and even sampling her voice. Oh Wow is the name of that track. And during his most recent tour dates in Australia, including footage of her on the Jumbotron borrowed from The World's a Girl music video shot by Nick's former longtime musical collaborator, Mick Harvey. And here's just a little snapshot of Nick's Gothic women, so to speak. We're focusing predominantly on Anita in this talk, but I just wanted to give a moment to show Beau Lazenby, who is next to Anita here, and then PJ Harvey, probably actually his most, outside of Susie, popularly known romantic relationship. And then we have Vivian Cornero, and then Susie Bick, now Cave. What is the Gothic woman? Sam is much better at going into all of this, and so I'm going to be very kind of quick and cursory in my perusal. But I just wanted to establish what I think are kind of four major themes or through lines or consistent patterns we see within the Gothic art world, whether that be literature, film, more recently television as well. And also, I would include music. Music not always being like the goth music genre, but the presence of the gothic within music. So we have the hysterical, in crisis, insane, possessed woman, right? We have the lust object and or the lusting object, the desiring object or the desired object, the erotic other shortly there. The monstrous or supernatural or magical other, and the victim or villain, right? And we see this is interchangeable on so many different levels. Everything from Laura to Carmilla falls into this scale. The narrator of the Yellow Wallpaper, Madeline from The Fall of the House of Usher, The Brides of Dracula, Mina and Lucy, and a lot of that 1970s gothic horror and giallo style film where it's like overblown to the point of almost being satire at a certain point. And I think that throughout Anita's work, it's evident that she kind of communicates a lot of these things, but specifically in Nick's lyrics, we see these as the major themes that comprise the role of the woman in his lyrics. So who's Anita? I want to start off by giving you a sensory introduction to her. So I'm going to play a small clip of her speaking and then a small clip of her singing, because I think that It's always best to introduce someone in their own words if you can, especially through their art. But also because I think Anita's voice was often overlooked by her much more famous long-term partner and collaborator, and I want to give her that moment. So I'm going to start off by playing a small clip of her actually speaking on this subject. The interview had asked her about if she was Nick's muse or not. A little clip of her Here's a little clip of her singing and performing. I really want the intonation and affect of her voice to come across. Anita was born March 18th, 1960. She passed away a few years ago, 2020 or 2021. She was born in Melbourne, Australia, and she passed away there as well. Though she lived in many places, including where you see that music video set, which is Marrakesh, Morocco. She met Cave while she was still in an advanced learning high school. He's a couple years older than her, where she was showing exceptional skill, just everyone raving about that skill in art, writing, fashion. And when asked to speak of Anita after her passing, this is what Nick wrote for the Red Hand Files, which, if you are a Nick fan, you're probably aware of. But if you're not, it's where he writes letters answering questions that his fans send in. Standing on the street in a baby doll dress, surrounded by sunshine, laughing and radiating a piercing beauty of such force you stop breathing. I could not believe my eyes. Later at my kitchen table, drawing things, she had a quickness of touch and a clear light line full of humor, throwing each drawing away and starting another, charged with a rampant, unstable, fatal energy that would follow her all her life. My line, amateur and ponderous. Everyone wanted to work with her, but it was like trying to trap lightning in a bottle. McCarvey managed to corral her into the recording studio, but these precious offerings are a fraction of what she was. She was the smartest and most talented of all of us by far. Walked into the most prestigious art college in Australia on a whim and talked her way into be given a place there. Bought an easel, some butcher's paper, some crayons, put on a dress, did her hair, and never went back in. She thought the best ideas were the ones that never saw the light of day. She was the brains behind the birthday party, wrote a bunch of their songs, wrote From Her to Eternity, The World's a Girl, Sugar in a Hurricane, and my favorite Bad Scene song, Stranger Than Kindness. But was much more than that. How could something so luminous carry so much darkness? Drank gin out of a baby's bottle, despised the concept of the muse but was everybody's. Spoke in a child's voice and was my best friend. 2 months ago, speaking to her on the phone, she seemed a million miles away. Loved her children more than anything. They were her pride and joy. It was both easy and terrifying to love her, leaves a big crying space. Of her music, John Bem of Reveler.org praised her ethereal, howling, whispering vocals, which due to her baby doll voice sound a bit like the ravings of a mentally disturbed child. Which I think is just a fantastic description, especially when you get to hear some of it. When I personally sat down with Mick Harvey, one of Cave's long-term collaborators, last month while I was in Melbourne. We talked, I was really eager to talk to him about Anita. He did so much work with her, including producing both of her solo records, recording the music video that we just saw a clip of, etc. Knew her as long as Nick Cave was as close to her for as long, and he spoke again to her brilliance, to her creativity, to her impracticality, her sensitivity, and also he really wanted to articulate the influence she had on so many spheres of Nick's way of being in the world, whether that was from styling him and sewing the clothes that he would wear on stage, to the co-writing for the songs she's credited for and the songs that she's not, to the person who convinced him to dye his hair black, and as we know, he's never gone back from that. So we really, really want to sing the praises of Anita. If you listen to her solo work, she's a sexual mystic, in my opinion. Her songs are full of religious imagery, interlocking with erotic and sexually explicit content, death and self loathing and despair, the limbs of the body, the pleasure of the body, the limits of the body, all with these Bardolian purrs and childlike simpering, conjuring back, right, to the Lolita of Cave's earliest creative and literary memories. Anita was beloved by everyone who met her, but no one could describe her in human terms, which is going to become increasingly relevant as we look at these songs. They rely on terms like fairy or elven or goddess or ghost or sex kitten or child vamp, like a punk rock Claudia version from Anne Rice's Vampire Chronicles. She's hysterical. She's dark. These are words that get used over and over again. And it's hard to tell how much her shared heroin addiction with Cave influenced this. But what everyone agrees upon is that Anita was other than human, right? A specter trapped here for a while, both painfully substantial and insubstantial at once, completely inspiring and absolutely always underrated. So we're gonna spend some time locating Cave's Gothic women in the lyrics, and when we say we're locating Cave's Gothic woman in the lyrics, we're gonna keep in mind that we're locating Anita in these lyrics. I have 6 songs. We're going to focus on 5 of them because, as we learned in session 1, with excitement, it tends to start feeling like rushing through, and I really want to be able to like luxuriate in each of these. So we're gonna keep Cabin Fever on standby, and we're going to do Dive Position, Zoom Music Girl, Kathy's Kisses, Deep in the Woods, and From Her to Eternity, of which this talk is titled after. And we are going to start with Dive Position, and I am going to play just a tiny bit of this song so that you can really get a feel for the sort of sensorium of it all. Boys Next Door, arguably maybe the easiest phase of Nick's earlier work to access if you are not interested in more extreme, discordant forms of music. This is when you can really hear the influence of David Bowie, Brian Eno, Roxy Music, Brian Ferry's vocals, right? T Rex, New York Dolls, etc. The Stooges. These were all really major influences. We have a kind of glam rock feel. Um, but the lyrics are extremely weird, right? Does a rain dance in my room. So we have this woman as a spectral, magical figure who is both believing in and performing of superstitions or rituals, right? This rain dance. And at the time, both Dada and Surrealism were really huge influences on Nick Cave and Roland S. Howard, who was went to school with Anita and then was in Boys Next Door and The Birthday Party, and would have a tremendous career of his own. Deserves his own talk, quite frankly. Uh, and so the surreal imagery painting the she of the song that is diving into the water, she is somehow summoned through her grim visions that leaves her damp with grief. In these water wings, which serve as buoys to keep her afloat, is for me a really fertile image, and it has a kind of haunted Alice in Wonderland esque experiencing when you allow yourself to really engage with the extent of the imagery. The motif of the bathtub in verse 2 links back to the imagery of verse 1, which is useful. And then the sound of the song itself, right, with this toy piano, it's so carnivalesque and has this grotesquerie of childlike voices and imagery performed with the vocal melodrama that feels Byronic and agonized. Cave paints for us the image of the she of the song, churning and gyrating about the room in an esoteric ritual meant to conjure rain from the heavens, even within the domestic space of his bedroom, shifting the shape of a home into a haunted place where spirits of nature can be called by one woman as a conductive force, as a tuning fork to the rain god that answers her prayers. Not only is she capable of conjuring otherworldly powers and spirits to the fore, but she's an oracle, a Pythia, a Sibyl capable of these great visions. But not good visions, right? We want to make the distinction here between the great versus the good visions. She is, after all, experiencing something grim that makes her damp with grief. Perhaps meaning that she is crying herself wet, right? But perhaps less straightforwardly that she is becoming like an old castle wall, damp with the condensation of the knowledge it holds within its bounds, or perhaps there's a more subliminal, erotic double entendre that is at stake. Thank God, though, of course, right, for her water wings and for the narrator's desperate pleas through his sighs that she touch him. That this effervescent lady of the waters who dances the elements into cooperation and weeps at her visions from beyond the veil ultimately succumb to his longing for her. It ends with this little passage that I love, right? Draped in shame, she runs the gauntlet, and we ask to where exactly. away from her visions and the rain into his arms, or away from his arms and back toward the state of nature which she has surely emerged from. This album is incredible. When I was recently in Melbourne, I made sure to pick up a really like rare edition of it from a local record store. Of folks that were part of Nick Cave and the Boys Next Door and birthday party scene. I really, really recommend you listen to all of it. And of course, all of these songs and the video footage is on the playlist. Our next song is maybe one of my top three Nick Cave songs, period. It's called Kathy's Kisses. It's incredible. I'm going to try and time little pieces of it so that you can kind of hear the increasing derangedness of the vocals. Again, this is a significantly more. So you really get a sense for the kind of increasing derangement, right? This is one of my favorite songs. I think it does so much justice to the strangeness of the music and the strain of Cave's voice. The dissonance, which monstrosity of his voice, and the equally surreal, disturbing lyrics. Kathy's kisses, more animus than action and given their own personhood, fall out of her mouth and onto the floor like blind chicks falling from that barbed wire of a song, right? And it seems like a simple but very horrifying image. A woman's mouth shaping kisses that somehow, of their own volition, fall from her lips and onto the floor, where they gather dust and are swept under a door. Okay, only to repeat over and over, more and more and more. But it conjures to mind far more strange and phantasmagoric rituals. Kathy, whose kisses are creatures like spiders or cockroaches, which might erupt from the small crevasse of her mouth and tumble onto a floor which has very clearly not been slept for a very long time, right? Um, is this an attic? You know, is this a basement? Is it a drawing room where white sheets blanket old furniture? Is this the corner of a bedroom left in disrepair or neglect? It has the taste to it, for me at least, of Otranto or Hill House, and clarifies a sense of evilness to the environment where Kathy's kisses fall out of the black hole of her mouth, this empty, gaping cavity, right? Um, Only to, in their teeming plenty, populate the dusty floor until the narrator must sweep them under the door into another room, out of sight, but not for long because they keep coming, right? More and more and more. I always hear this song, I listen to it, and I'm always left asking myself, who is Kathy? Who is the woman whose kisses are fleeing vermin? Is she a captive? Is she held prisoner in the room? Or is she the monster, which calls it her domain? Is she a willing beseecher of kisses, or does the narrator take them from her more and more and more? When one considers the lyrics hologrammatically superimposed over the sound of the song and its increasing fervor and madness, we experience the narrator transforming, becoming more unhinged and maddened by Kathy and her kisses. She is perhaps his captive, but she is also, quite frankly, if we look at these lyrics and we listen to the way his voice coagulates and strains over time, she's his torturer as well. The song for me always feels like it could be plucked right out of an Edgar Allan Poe kind of collection. It's so rich, the imagery is so dark and gothic and full of horror and desire and madness. Absolutely incredible song. And that's from Prayers on Fire. Largely considered, I think, probably their most monumental album. And then we move on to our Zoo Music Girl. I am again going to play a small, much smaller this time, clip from this song so you can understand the sound because the sound is really integral to the story it is telling. On an instrumental level, right, we immediately notice a frenzied, animalistic, possessory rhythm with the drums taking on a jungle rhythm and Roland's guitar cutting jagged and fang like through the music. Tracy's bass is a predator prowling through the underbrush, strutting through alley sand, dark passageways, voluptuous and dangerous. When you listen to the instrumentals, you would not assume at first that this is a love song, that this is a song of fevered devotion, obsession, romance, because it sounds at once like a berserker war dance interfacing with an exotified Dionysian revelry. The biographer of Nick Cave, Mark Mordew, who wrote Boy on Fire that chronicles the early years of Nick Cave's life from birth till about 19 when they got on the plane to go to the UK. He mentions in particular that this song is written about Anita. Cave's voice here is squeezed through a strange pipe, a dark instrument of mystery and desperation. He is a disciple pleading and a madman unraveling. The zoo music girl is as much the name of the love object as the folk devil he is contractually obligated to be ensnared by. The intimation of the words together conjures to mind a feral animal and its wild behavior, the sounds of roars and crying creatures, a woman who is more a leopard or hyena than lady, and our narrator chases after her unpredictable and even dangerous movements with ardor and zeal. There is an intentional primitivism being evoked both by virtue of the instrumentation and lyrics. Rattle your sticks instead of dragging out the orchestra, right? And as we see in the following line, but upon examination of the following lines, the sound is beautiful. It's perfect. The sound of her young legs in stockings, rhythm of the walk, it's beautiful. Evokes the image that it's her legs which are the sticks that rattle. It is the motion of her body, her feet pounding against the earth, the shifting of her weight, which creates this sound which drives him crazy and he finds so irresistible. She becomes a witch who casts a spell on him by the very virtue of her stride. This spell from the wild Jew music girl makes him into a monster, drives him insane, roasts his heart in flame. I mean, like, come on, the viscera of these lyrics, the really intense sense of embodiment within them as well. It speaks to additional layers of limerence and lust and desire as the mechanism or the vehicle for madness, right? He kisses the hem of her skirt. He buries himself in his own coffin, and eventually he cannot help himself from murdering the dress, destroying the spell of his zoo music girl, trying to almost emancipate him from it. Even though by the end, right, he's singing about how he's trying to call her by her family name. This calls attention to the perilous romance of the song and the powerlessness of the narrator to sustain his desire, and it casts as much of a spell on the listener as the zoo music girl casts on him. We're left chasing after her as well, wanting to know more about who she is. It also is important, I think, to share some attention toward the chanting of that name, Zoo Music Girl, over and over again, a conjuration, an incantation, as if we're trying to summon her or call her to us, right? But also, it is like a haunting or an intrusive thought that pounds into a mind made fragile with lust. I think all of us have been in that place where, in the throes, perhaps of a new romance, you almost can't think of anything else because your mind is colonized. It's infected by the name, the face, the image. And I think this song so effectively does it by the repetition of the zoo music girl. I also love that he recorded these as separate tracks. So it sounds when you listen to the primary lyrics like he is arguing with himself, that he is wandering around, perhaps an abandoned castle, a moor, a dark alleyway somewhere, having this Gogol-esque kind of debate with himself, this Jekyll and hiding kind of process. And I also both this song and our next song showcase images that I like to link to the idea of Heathcliff grieving and the cemetery dirt as a rich motif within the lexicon. I am going to play a little bit now from Deep in the Woods. This is a live performance. I chose to go with this particular live performance because I think the image and the role of performance is as much something you can read mechanistically identically to a novel as anything that is pure language or word in its own language, and it really compounds those circumstances. God, there's some really great footage of Roland S. Howard in this too. Let me pull this up. Perfect. I'm going to switch to this slide so that you have access to the lyrics that we're going to be talking about here as well. When I first started talking to my friends about how I was going to be teaching this, especially my birthday party, enthusiast friends all messaged me and they were like, "You're going to be doing Deep in the Woods, right? You're going to be doing Deep in the Woods, right?" And of course, I was going to do Deep in the Woods. Um, as a cave scholar, one of the things that really interests me in particular is sort of charting the shifts in his voice, his writing style, his performance, and mapping the influence of those shifts. And you can really tell that things are changing by the time we get to this point for him. Deep in the Woods is absolutely one of the songs that signifies the shift. There's another one on this combined LP that's a combination of two EPs. Mutiny the Bad Seed listed here, one of my favorite recordings of the birthday party period. The Mutiny in Heaven is a retelling of Lucifer's fall. You see him starting to do this shift as well, right? So tension between Nick and Roland was really heightened at this point. They wanted to tell different songs and stories, and Roland was still very interested in the more surreal, Dadaist, kind of absurd lyrics. And Cave wanted to tell stories. He wanted to do something that was narrative driven, persona driven, right? And so you start to feel Roland leaving the band here, and you understand that Cave is taking things into what will eventually become the Bad Seeds. You're going to notice, like, if you look at these lyrics, that these lyrics are not pulling on the same influences that we saw in the former lyrics. I mean, first of all, we can consider somewhat similar to Zoo Music Girl, but very different in content. It's longer. There's a story that seems to evolve along a continuum, right? We don't have the priority on kind of bizarro abstractions and literary disjointedness. I think that this has a lot to do with the fact that around this time, Cave is getting very into the Southern Gothic. In particular, he's loving Flannery O'Connor. He's loving Cormac McCarthy. He's devouring images and ideas from the American South's most dark storytellers, but also kind of most ironic storytellers as well. He's reading a lot of Faulkner too, and perhaps he's seeing something that feels resonant for him and home-like, in tribute to where he was born, right? And the landscape he experienced in rural towns of Australia, and this sort of cultural legacy of Australia as well. Far less erratic and caustic on a sonic level. I wouldn't say it's necessarily easy listening, but by and large, melody and narrative are usurping the role of chaos and anti art of the former songs, right? It's hypnotic, it's despairing, it relies on a more sparing, minimalistic instrumentation that identifies Cave's voice and storytelling, as opposed to conflicts or competes with it. This would become a signature of his band, The Bad Seeds, which follows the devolution of the birthday party. The POV here is tenuous. You can make arguments that the narrator is detailing his own murdering of the woman, or for a more omniscient roaming POV, but the impactful final verse and its very strong eye and identification with being one of love's lonely, ugly children makes a strong argument for this being a confession of murder, which would coincide with a deep interest that he was developing for American murder ballads at the same time. The woman is doubled, a common motif in the Gothic, both as a terrestrial and material body of a decomposing corpse, and the etheric, supernatural, innocent form of the girl, who's outlined only in the shape of a dress in the well. A divide here is between the earthly body of a victim and its spirit, but the spirit as trapped as the earthly body by the binds of the narrator. It conjures to mind Rossetti's How They Met Themselves and the doppelganger as double or as herald of death, or at least inextricable from death. And here we also have the performance of as Gothic. Is it the Byronic hero? Is it the vampire? Is it a weird metonym for both? Can one be both? How fundamental is the difference? How does a cacophony of sound and light further cast Cave and in this footage Roland too as supernatural and spectral? Does he feel like the murderer and the lover? Does he feel like one more than the other? These are the questions that Deep in the Woods starts to evoke, and all of them surrounding the sort of in absentia of this woman who only exists as a decomposing body in a ditch. And so we move on to our final song. This is From Her to Eternity, probably one of his most famous songs, one of his most played live songs. And I'm going to show just a very short momentary clip from one of the original live performances, the earliest live footage I can find of him singing this, to what was essentially, I think, about 6 months ago, a year ago maximum, on the Wild God tour. Pretty incredible to get to see the full spectrum for that early Shivers clip of him as a teenager to where he is now as a 68-year-old man. Um, for this, I'm actually going to read uh, a little passage from a paper I recently presented at a conference. The section that focuses on this song in particular, because I did a closer reading of it. You have access to all the lyrics now, so you can kind of follow if it interests you to do so. Carol Sent asserts that the Gothic encompasses a counterbalance produced by writers and thinkers who recognize that the power of the past, the irrational and the violent, continues to hold sway in the world. The violence of the world must be head on. Duelers at Dawn, Jonathan Harker in Dracula's Castle, Victor Frankenstein gazing up at his creature, Nick Cave looming above his audience with a finger outpointed and outstretched. Orson Scott Card taxonomized three types of fear according to the affective influence. The Gothic dialectic floats across Card's taxonomy between the thesis of dread and the antithesis of horror, and catheximist terror, enough knowing to anticipate, and horror, the aftermath of knowing. Terror communicates via sublimality, recognizing the presence of the monstrosity. Horror communicates posthumously. Excessive terror has occurred such that the noumenal is vanished and vanquished from the phenomenal. Stalwart motifs of the Gothic are strange places, a castle, a manor, desolate or desecrated places, an atmosphere of mystery or suspense, omens, portents, or visions, supernatural or inexplicable events, isolation, high emotion, and women in distress. Early career Cave often substitutes his castles for junkyards, alleyways, and dilapidated urban housing complexes, and the titular track from the album From Her to Eternity incorporates all of the aforementioned Gothic motifs. Co-authored with Anita Lane, From Her to Eternity is a Gothic novel as song. The first verse begins. I want to tell you about a girl. You know, she lives in apartment 29. Why? That's the one right on top of mine. I start to cry. I start to cry. Establishing three important characters: a crying narrator, heightened emotions, a woman living above the narrator, and a location, the apartment complex. And location is always a character, right? So the song continues, revealing the strangeness of the building and an invisible woman crying and pacing through the lonesome night, this woman in distress. The first verse lashes out. Hot tears come splashing on down, leaking through the cracks, down upon my face, I catch them in my mouth, emphasizing a surreal, grotesque ardor through the exceptionally intimate unreality of catching tears falling through ceiling cracks into one's mouth. The succeeding verse continues. I read her dirty diary on her sheets, scrutinizing every little piece of dirt, tore out a page and stuffed it inside my shirt, fled out of the window. Cave's intentionally obtuse about whether the narrator physically enters the above apartment or whether the entire sequence is hallucinatory. Climbing down a vine out of her nightmare and back into mine suspends time and space in what is real or imagined in a characteristically Gothic way, made manifold by desire as madness as machine. This delirium undermines reliable narration, exacerbated by the successive verse. A paranoid separation between the lover and the love object explodes Cave's language, punctuated by the strain of his voice. The winnowing keen of guitar echoes the cacophony of intrusive thoughts. The narrator's eroticization, them blue stockings, his obsessive urinating, standing like this with my ear to the ceiling, and his observation of her melancholy concretize the Gothic, weaving them together by the desperate cracking in his throat like a lost prayer. The final verse provides the missing piece: supernatural phenomena and vision. It concludes, why the ceiling still shakes, why the fixtures turn to serpent snakes. The desire to possess her is a wound, and it's nagging at me like a shrew, but I know that to possess her is therefore not to desire her. The narrator's desire becomes a poltergeist through which an awful haunting occurs. The same ceiling which feeds him the drop of his love object's tears shakes. All the fixtures in the apartment take Ophidian forms, symbols of infestation. The wound of his desire to possess her, only excised by closing the distance between them, freeing himself of the madness of both isolation and her specter. The title, a clever play on Zinman's film, creates Gothic intimations by destabilizing time. Time cannot move or progress while the narrator is caught within the strange, discordant cogs of her footsteps, of her falling tears. Time hold and told by the hauntology of desire's landscape. Cave circumvents, relying exclusively upon the diminishing returns of verbal language through fluency in performance, aesthetics, and instruments, insinuating Felix Mendelssohn's position that what music expresses is not too vague for words, but rather too precise. When referring to Cave's text, the implication is never words, but rather all modes of communicating, affecting, and cathecting. It's not enough for the lyrics From Her to Eternity to fulfill Gothic taxonomies. The performance of From Her to Eternity and the personification of its hauntings becomes a subtextual language demanding to be read, and Cave, a 20th century Heathcliff seizing on the page of the stage. In conclusion, I want to play a kind of happy note, a final note, which is Anita Lane's performance, just a small moment of it in her cover of These Boots Are Made for Walking. As someone who is constantly being forced into the role of the muse, the inspiration, the whatever, this song feels really tongue in cheek. It feels like a fun reclamation, and it also feels like a cute full circle because the first video that the Boys Next Door ever recorded was also a cover of These Boots Are Made for Walking. I want to thank everyone for joining me. Here are some key collaborators, influences on Cave, his different bands that he played and performed with. And I would love to just dedicate this talk and our time together to the memory of Anita Lane.